This video we're going to be looking at types of conformity. So a good place to start would be defining what we mean by conformity. So conformity is a type of social influence that occurs when an individual changes their behaviour or beliefs or attitudes due to real or imagined group pressure. So it's where one individual changes as a result of the attitudes and behaviour or attitudes of a majority. So it's a type of majority influence. Really important because as we get to the end of this topic, we're going to be looking at minority influence. Also really important that you can provide examples of conformity. So I'd encourage you to pause the video at this point and think of a time where you've experienced conformity in everyday life, where you have been influenced by those around you, by the majority. So we're going to be looking at 3 different types of conformity. Really important not to get this confused with explanations for conformity, which will come in the next video. So when we talk about types of conformity, we're talking about 3 types: compliance, identification, and internalization. And we can think of these in terms of the depth of conformity. Another way to think about types of conformity is the ways in which people conform. So we'll look at each of these in turn and we'll look at some examples. So in order to determine the type of conformity, we need to consider 2 things. We need to consider whether the behaviour or belief or attitude is changing both publicly, so when surrounded by the majority, and privately, when the person is on their own. And we need to consider whether the behaviour or belief is a short-term change or a long-term change. If we can answer those 2 questions, then we can determine which type of conformity is present. So let's have a look at our first type, which is compliance. Compliance is the most shallow type of conformity. Compliance occurs when an individual changes their public behaviour, but not their private beliefs. And so when surrounded by the majority, they're going to go along with the majority. But once they're in private and their group pressure is no longer there, they're going to revert back to their old ways. And so the change is often just superficial and temporary. Compliance stops when there are no longer any group pressures, when they are no longer in the proximity of the majority. And so it's the lowest level of conformity. It's very, very shallow, very superficial, and it only lasts as long as the group is monitoring us. We change our behaviour according to compliance because I guess we're hoping to achieve a favourable reaction from the group. We're hoping to gain rewards or social approval. And so an example of this could be to do with a football match. For example, you might claim to support a certain football team because many others your age and group do. For example, you might say that you're really into football to be one of the lads, and you don't want to be sort of rejected or ridiculed by them. However, privately, you have very little interest in a team or sport at all. At home, you would never choose to tune into any sports. You would never bet on any matches, for example. So that's going along with the group in public, but in private, that behaviour change stops. So we haven't truly changed our behaviour to go along with the group. Another example of this, a very contemporary example, could be wearing a mask only when your head of year enters the room. So you haven't truly changed your behaviour. You don't truly accept that wearing a mask is beneficial for the safety of yourself and others. It's only when surrounded by the majority or only when there is somebody there enforcing the rules. So this is the lowest level of conformity, superficial and temporary. Next, in terms of, say, a moderate level of conformity, we move on to identification. So identification is when a person conforms to the opinions or attitudes or beliefs or behaviour of a group because there is something about that group that we value. We want to identify with the group because we value group membership. And for this reason, we change our behaviours to be accepted by the group. However, we might not privately agree with everything the group stands for. But while we value the membership of this group, we are changing our behaviours. So this is usually a short-term change. The behaviour is generally temporary and it's not maintained when the individual leaves the group. So while we're a part of that group and we value group membership, our behaviour is going to be it will be changed. But as soon as the person leaves the group, then they're going to revert back to their old ways. So when we identify with a group, we want to have an affinity with that group. We value that group. We want to establish or maintain a relationship with that group. So there is something about that group that we want to be a part of. So identification can be thought of as group membership. Think here of, for example, joining the army and adopting the behaviour and the beliefs of your fellow soldiers. So, you know, talking in army code, using 24-hour time. We adopt those behaviours because we value being in the military. We value being an army soldier. We want to be a part of that group, so we adopt the behaviours of that group. However, once you leave the army for civilian life, you're no longer going to talk in 24-hour time. Your behaviours and opinions that you adopted while in the army are going to revert back to what they were before you joined that group. So then finally, we move on to internalization, and this is the deepest level of conformity. Internalization is when a person genuinely changes their public behaviour, beliefs and attitudes, as well as their private behaviour, beliefs and attitudes. They genuinely accept that the majority is correct. When it comes to internalization, the content of the message matters. You have to truly believe that the majority is right. So, for example, wearing a mask because you genuinely believe that it is going to protect you and that it's going to be necessary to combat COVID. So we accept the majority as correct. And for that reason, because ideas and actions and beliefs are intrinsically rewarding, we want to be right. So this is where there's genuine acceptance of group norms. And this means that it's usually a long-term change. This is likely going to be permanent. It's not because we value the group, it's not because we want to be accepted by the group, we genuinely believe the group. And so that is going to be a long-term change. We've internalized their attitudes. That has become now a part of our belief system. It's part of what the person truly, truly thinks. And it means then that their behavior is going to be congruent with their belief system. We're going to behave in a way that reflects our attitudes and beliefs. And so behavior is likely to be shown both publicly and privately. When we come to look at minority influence later in the social influence topic, we're going to be talking about conversion. And this is when a minority, so a small group of people, are able to influence the majority. And they do this through internalization. So this is where the majority are going to internalize the message of the minority. They're going to thoroughly process what the minority group are saying, and then they're going to incorporate that in their belief system. So we're going to pay attention to the minority because they're credible and they've persuaded us because their message is correct. And we'll see lots of examples of this throughout history. For example, attitudes on homosexuality, attitudes on women's suffrage, attitudes on recycling, for example. This is all happening due to internalization. We genuinely believe that the message the minority is spreading is correct. And so we incorporate that into our own belief system. So our behaviour is going to change publicly and privately, and this conformity is going to be long-lasting. So let's summarise then. Here we've got a nifty little diagram to break down the different types of conformity. So here we've got compliance. This can be thought of best as group acceptance. So we're conforming to the beliefs and the behaviours of the group because we want to gain rewards and we want to avoid disapproval from the group. So here we've got conformity at a public level, but not a private level. And remember, this is likely to be short term. This is only happening while we are being monitored by the group. Next, we move on to identification. This can be best thought of as group membership. So here we're accepting social influence, we're accepting the behaviours and the beliefs of the group because this is to do with how much we value that group. It's to do with the demands of the given role. For example, your role as an army soldier. So think of this as your role within a group and how much you identify with that group and value membership of that group. So this is conformity regardless of private feelings. We're going along with the group, both privately and publicly, but only because we value that group. We might not privately agree with all of the beliefs of the group, but our membership, how much we value membership is greater than needing to privately agree with all of the beliefs of the group. And then finally, we move on to internalization. This is true conformity. This is where we genuinely accept the group norms. We genuinely accept their beliefs and their attitudes and their behaviors because we've adopted that as part of our own belief system. So for that reason, we have private as well as public conformity.